is Emmeline Foster, and I'm the Executive Director of the French-American Foundation in the United States. I am really excited to have with us today Doug Heye and Rickey Bevington for a discussion on the future of the Republican Party. It is a very exciting time for all of us, and we are really interested in this topic. Before we start and before I introduce Rickey, I would like to thank our partner, the French Institute Alliance Française, for their support of our work and for co-sponsoring the event with us today. I know our two speakers are very fond of France, so I'm really looking forward to having this discussion. I hope, Rickey, you will mention a few of the things that Doug told us of discussion, his trip to France and what he likes to do in France. But my role right now is to introduce Rickey. Rickey is our moderator today, and she is a brand new 2020 young leader, and we're very proud to have her with us. She's an internationally recognized journalist and speaker, and we already had her 2 times as a moderator, so we're using her skill at the French-American Foundation, and we're very grateful for that. She's based in Atlanta. She's a mainstay with Georgians as local host of NPR's All Things Considered. Her radio and television stories have drawn honors from Edward R. Murrow Awards, Southeast Emmys, Atlanta Press Club, Society of Professional Journalists, and the Associated Press. She also hosts an ongoing live radio program with Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms and has been named by both Georgia Trend magazine and the Atlanta Business Chronicle among the 40 under 40 leaders making a positive impact in Georgia. So you can see that the French-American Foundation knows how to select their young leaders. And I know that she actually recently also had a discussion with Ambassador Etienne on her show. So thank you both for taking the time to be with us today. Rickey, I will let you introduce Doug, and I can't wait to hear this discussion. Thank you again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emmeline. What a nice introduction. It's such an honor to be a 2020 French-American Foundation Young Leader, and I'm really looking forward to the programming throughout this year and next year. Thank you to French-American Foundation and the French Institute Alliance Française for hosting today's conversation. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. And of course, welcome to our audience. I am going to guess that some of you are in the United States and maybe some of you are in Europe and maybe other places. So we'll hope to make this as an international and inclusive conversation as possible. Doug and I are both Francophiles. I think he told me about a little partying he did in Amiens a couple years ago that maybe he can share with us. The life of a political advisor sounds very romantic, Doug. So thank you for saying yes to this invitation, and we're so pleased to have you, especially in the middle of a workday. So thanks to everybody for taking time. Before I introduce Doug, I just want to remind everybody, at least in the United States, what's at stake when we talk about the future of a political party. Here in the US, of course, there are only 2 major political parties. Yes, there are the Greens and Libertarians that are effective on the edges, but at the end of the day, in all practicality, we have 2 parties. And so what happens at the very top of these parties that Doug's going to talk to us about today really influences every down ballot race, governor, mayor, all the way down to dog catcher, because these candidates that we know in our local communities are aligning themselves with the platform and vision and ideas of the national party. So that's really what's at stake for all Americans in a conversation like this. And we should all be looking at the future of our political parties as stakeholders in our democracy. So with all of that said, I will introduce Doug Heye, a veteran of politics since 1990. Doug Heye is a former communications director for the Republican National Committee. He was deputy chief of staff to then House Majority Leader Eric Cantor and former aide to Senator Richard Burr. Doug is a North Carolina native. He's currently a CNN political commentator and contributor to the Wall Street Journal, where he provides analysis on domestic and international political events. Heye was a fall 2015 resident fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Institute of Politics, focusing on crisis communications. He's garnered on-the-record bipartisan praise for his team-building, communications, and strategic planning abilities. He has been called a pros pro by Politico, by his counterpart at the Democratic National Committee for what his handling of what CNN labeled one of the most demanding jobs in Washington. In April 2020, Heye was named Senior Vice President of Media at Kraft Media Digital, advising clients on crisis communications, media relations, and executive positioning. Doug Heye, we welcome your expertise, and the floor is yours.
Great,
Welcome.
thank you. I should say as a preface, I always say yes to anything French related I get asked to do, in part because my great-grandfather was born in Paris. I've spent a great deal of time in France itself and also working with the embassy here. And if you can tell, I don't know how great the lighting is. Over my right shoulder are vineyard maps of Burgundy. And because of this occasion, I pulled out my Johnny Hallyday coffee mug, which I'll be using throughout, not just as a prop, but for my coffee.
For the concert that you went to in Amiens, right?
Yeah, so I'll give a quick version of that story. And I had seen him before, but I did a trip with the French embassy to mostly to Paris in December of 2015. And they said, well, was there a cultural activity you'd like to go to? Would you like to go to Tour d'Argent or go to the opera or the ballet? And I said, I see Johnny Hallyday is playing in Amiens. That's what I would like to go to. And I think I was the only American in the entire arena. So it was fantastic. So with that as a very strange preface, I know we're talking about the future of the Republican Party. And so I'll tell you kind of an answer that won't make any sense at first, but we'll explain why. What is the future of the Republican Party? I have no idea. And the reason I have no idea is severalfold. One, we don't really know what's going to happen yet on election day. And we don't know what those ramifications are going to be. The Republican Party has gone through a real change over the past, not just 4 years with Donald Trump, but really 6, 8, 10 years before that. And it's part of what I initially saw working in both the Republican National Committee in the 2010 elections when we took back the House. And for a frame of reference, things were so bad for Republicans after Barack Obama got elected that in Washington, D.C., you could feel it palpably. You could feel it in the air in January, February, March of 2009, that the Republican Party basically didn't exist. Later that year, Time magazine ran on its cover a picture of an elephant, which is the Republican Party's symbol, and declared the Republican Party an endangered species. No one in America thought that 16 months later, 18 months later, the Republican Party would take back the House of Representatives. Part of why it did was fueled by tax increases and a bill that we now know as Obamacare, and voter reaction to that swept up 63 seats that Republicans picked up in the House. We picked up a few seats in the Senate as well. And that was only a new Congress, it was a new conference in the Republican Party. In the House, Republicans call themselves the House Republican Conference, Democrats call themselves a caucus, yet another thing they can't agree on. And this was a very different makeup of what we saw from these new members of Congress. One member came in and said to then Speaker to be John Boehner, or newly elected Speaker John Boehner, I didn't come here to be part of any team. And in politics, it's very hard to do things on your own. And that really was, to me, the beginning of what got us to where Republicans were put in position for Donald Trump to take over, a kind of a hostile takeover, if you will, of the Republican Party. He very accurately, and I think very smartly, saw, even if he was only running to raise his profile, get news stories, and host Saturday Night Live and all those other things, he very smartly saw a Republican Party that was fractured. And it was fractured in 10 different ways, even though it had the House of Representatives, had the United States Senate. The Republican Party was torn apart and tearing itself apart. We saw this in the government shutdown of 2013, and where Republicans couldn't agree within itself on what to do, so we weren't organized enough to outfox the Democrats. Essentially, we were fighting with ourselves more than we were fighting with Democrats. Most of what I spent my time with in working in the majority leader's office was dealing more with our own internal politics than what are we really going to do about Obamacare. And I spent every day in 2014 working on Obamacare. But most of that was within the confines of what can Republicans do. And ultimately, as we've seen, not much. Then in June of 2014, Eric Cantor, the majority leader, the presumptive speaker, to the point that John Boehner had a kind of a very secret retirement plan that got blown up because on a Tuesday in June, Eric Cantor lost his primary in an election that no one saw coming. I didn't see it coming. The majority leader didn't see it coming. No one in his district did. His opponent didn't. This took everyone by surprise and was yet again another one of these canary in a coal mine situations that should have told everybody, Republicans, you have a much broader problem here. And the challenge was, this isn't just an issue, this isn't just about issues. It wasn't just about what are we going to do about healthcare? What are we going to do about immigration? What are we going to do about spending and so forth? A lot of these issues where you've seen Republicans sort of really do a 180 on things in the Trump years. This was this was a fight as much about fighting as it was anything else. One of the things that I would hear so often in Republican conference meetings, or from senators like Ted Cruz, was that we needed to fight more. And that's fine if you have a strategy and tactics that you can employ to land punches on your opponent, knock them down, and win the fight. But quite often what we saw was a battle of who wanted to fight the hardest, which means who wanted to yell the loudest, and ultimately who wanted to throw the most punches to be seen as throwing a lot of punches, regardless of whether they were effective or not. Again, this is where Donald Trump, I think, very adroitly saw an opportunity that he could be truly the loudest voice in the room, that he could be the most extreme voice in the room. And given how celebrity culture is so important here, he knew that he would garner as much attention as he wanted to always be that loudest voice in the room and keep everyone reacting to him. And then again, on the talk of issues, in 2012, Mitt Romney lost. Mitt Romney was a good candidate, not a great candidate, but somebody who, by and large, Americans would have been comfortable with as president. But he failed to connect with voters, and Republicans then needed to learn lessons from what happened and why. And the number one takeaway of the 2012 election, which we then saw play out in what the Republican National Committee put together as an autopsy, was that we had a real problem on immigration, and we had a real problem with Hispanic voters and minority voters as a whole. And if you had asked me in the days after the 2012 election, would Republicans move something on immigration? I would tell you absolutely so, because I spent the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday after Election Day 2012 with Cantor as he was calling almost every Republican member of Congress, asking them, what did you see? What did you learn? And to a person, they said, oh, we've got a real problem with immigration. We've got a real problem with Hispanics, with minorities, how we talk about them. We have a problem with women voters. All these things that sound pretty familiar a few years later, because we haven't really addressed them. And the reason that we haven't is every day that we move past the 2012 election, it stopped becoming we've got a problem, and it was they've got a problem. So as we tried to move some type of immigration legislation or even talk about immigration, our members were telling us that was Mitt Romney's problem. That's the National Republican Party's problem. That's not my problem in my congressional district. And we had a conference meeting that was part of a retreat where we planned on talking about our immigration principles. Here's kind of what we would like to do. Not a bill, no structure like that anywhere near that point then. And immigration was dead for that year before that meeting was even over. Our members overwhelmingly said, we can't do this. And so again, we find ourselves in these same struggles. What are the challenges Donald Trump has? He has problems with women. He has problems with Hispanics. He has problems with African Americans, as do Republicans throughout the party. And I'd say kind of two last things on this, and then I would love to take as many questions as we can. We're starting to see the Republican Party react to what a future with Donald Trump may be like. And that's everybody sort of jockeying for position. They're doing that nationally, where you see Nikki Haley is going to Iowa soon. Kristi Noem is going to South Carolina soon, the governor, or excuse me, to Iowa soon, both of them. The former governor of South Carolina and the current governor of South Dakota. It's not a coincidence that you're going to see more women stepping up. You have senators who really don't want to deal on any kind of a stimulus right now. People like Ted Cruz from Texas, Josh Hawley from Missouri, Tom Cotton from Arkansas. They don't love Donald Trump, despite anything they may say publicly. They need to position themselves politically for what 2024 is going to be like. This is one of the ways they do it. Obviously, we can talk about whether or not it's successful or will be successful. And then I'd point to Liz Cheney in the House of Representatives. A couple months ago, she made a lot of noise and got a lot of news by publicly disagreeing with some comments the president made. And she has done that from time to time, essentially positioning herself in the next House of Representatives to lead the Republican Party by saying, you know, I was with this president almost every step of the way. I agreed with so many of the policies, but when he did something wrong, when I disagreed with him, I stood up and I was a truth teller. It's a very stark contrast from where Steve Scalise and Kevin McCarthy have been on all things Trump over the past 4 years. And what was the thanks that Liz Cheney got? In a meeting, several members stood up and basically protested her, which has never happened. You've never seen kind of an organized alliance like this, and all of the government shutdowns and failing plans for tax cuts or Obamacare. We never saw an organized effort to really go after one member like Liz Cheney did. So what is the future of the Republican Party? We don't know, but those are what all the fights are going to be. And I'm reminded of, you know, despite whatever the losses are going to be for Donald Trump, assuming he loses, which I do, but I wouldn't bet a lot of money on that right now. There's a line that was used in the 1970s when a U.S. cabinet official was exonerated from charges of corruption. And he said, where do I go to get my reputation back? A lot of Republicans are going to be asking that question at the same time that there are going to be a lot of other Republicans who are saying, what are you talking about? We finally got our reputation back. That's the divide, and then it gets more fractured from there. So this is going to be a national, state, and local fight. And what the results are going to be, we're all going to have to sit back and watch.
It's a lot of fodder for us to begin with, and I will.
A long way of saying I don't know.
No, what you're doing is you're showing us the tea leaves so that we may have more information to join you in looking into the future. So I will encourage our audience to, in the Q&A, I think you can put your questions for Doug, and please be curious, be expansive. You know, we really want to hear from everybody. But I'll just start out with saying, you know, I'm a journalist, so I go straight to the data. And the data is showing that the Trump's core base are much older, like in their 70s, older baby boomers, white, male, tend to be rural, tend to not be college educated. And then there's a slice of older Gen Xers as well. Now, statistically, those groups are not going to be the largest voter groups in the future. So how can we look at the tea leaves of just the data of the American electorate and what the American electorate looks like to say, well, that may help influence things at the national party level?
Yeah, one of the challenges for Republicans is whether or not demographics will be destiny. And this is a country that's getting more diverse. You're seeing this in key states where it's getting browner, to be blunt about it, more African-American and more African-Americans registering to vote, more Hispanics, especially in Hispanic growth, and more of them registering to vote at a higher percentage. And women, where Republicans have struggled as well, really stepping up over what we saw in 2018, really making their voice heard in a way that we didn't see in previous elections. This should spell real trouble for Republicans. Their challenge is that for a lot of them, it's not an immediate concern. And that goes down to demographics in states and especially congressional districts. The way that the congressional districts are drawn is that each state draws their districts however they see fit, as long as the courts don't strike them out. In some states, they may cut deals to where they can go to certain, say, African-American or Hispanic, if a Republican's in charge. an African American or Hispanic Democrat and say, we'll put more African Americans or more Hispanics in your district, making your reelection easier if we can make our districts a little wider and easier for us. And so the reality is, for those members of Congress who rejected our immigration plan or even to talk about immigration, it's because their districts are a lot more white and rural and older than really the makeup of the country. So it's a skewed perspective that they have. Then the other part of it is Republicans don't talk to these voters very well or very often. And because they don't do it often, they don't do it very well. I remember, on some background, my first job was for a segregationist senator. Then I ended up working for the first African-American Republican National Committee chair, and then the highest ranking Jewish Republican in elected office. So I've seen kind of every view of racial politics in the Republican Party. And the reality is, in minority media especially, those relationships just don't exist. I remember speaking to a meeting of Republican House press secretaries. So people were representing their bosses, talking to newspapers and radio stations and so forth. And I asked, how many of you have any kind of relationship with African-American or Hispanic media, minority media in your district? And very few hands went up. Now, part of that is some of those districts just don't have that. But the other reality is those that do just don't have those relationships. And the excuses I've heard a million times. They hate us. It's a waste of time. Why would I bother doing that? And because you don't bother doing it, and because you view it as a waste of time, they're always going to hate you. And Republicans have struggled in breaking out of that mindset. Bizarrely, I think Donald Trump could have done something about that, especially with African-American voters. When he gave the message of what the hell do you have to lose, if there were any substance behind that, I think Trump could have done very well on that. I have given very, very little advice to Donald Trump and his campaign over the years. But the one piece of advice I did give back in 2015 was no national politician had gone to Flint, Michigan yet, when the water situation was really at its biggest crisis. And if Donald Trump had gone to Flint, Michigan before Hillary Clinton or anyone else and said, it's your governor's fault, it's your mayor's fault, it's your Congress's fault, and I'm the only person who can fix it, kind of what he says with everything else, I think America's collective head would have exploded at how he would then have been able to get not 7% of the African-American vote, but maybe 17 or 27%. And if he's at those numbers right now, he's invincible. But unfortunately, there was never any substance there. And that may continue to rule our destiny. And it's why we're talking about states now that we haven't talked about in the past, Georgia and Texas being the two biggest examples.
There's so much in Georgia that I could tell you, just following the Senate races here. Mm-hmm. And I was at the 2007 Republican State Convention in Georgia when then Republican Senator Saxby Chambliss spoke very briefly, and he mentioned limited amnesty for illegal immigrants. And there were 3 people in the very back of the hall who booed. Mm-hmm. The entire room turned and they couldn't believe that there was this very small group. And we now know that that was exactly what you were talking about in your presentation. It was for those of us who've been watching for a while, we have some great questions coming in. So I'm going to piggyback on one of these, which is that I'm not going to say this name right. So Alexandre, thank you so much for joining us today. And he asks, is it realistic to think that there could ultimately be a split within the Republican Party in the creation of 2 separate conservative parties?
It is possible. And, it's interesting because this comes at a time when the parties are actually weaker than they've ever been. And I think that's one of the reasons that we find ourselves in this situation. What we saw with the McCain-Feingold law, which, if you might recall, George Bush signed into law assuming that it would get overturned by the Supreme Court, which it didn't, which affected fundraising for the National Party. And then the Citizens United Supreme Court decision that said that outside groups could raise basically unlimited money. It meant that the Republican National Committee became less important. the Democratic National Committee became less important. Barack Obama set up what he called Organizing for America because he didn't want to deal with the DNC structure, which further weakened it. So the parties are weaker right now than they ever were. They're raising more money than they ever have. Everyone is raising more money than they ever have. But the Republican Party is fractured in several different directions. And the only thing I can tell you for sure is that populism is going to be a real part of it moving forward, regardless of what happens with Trump. But you're already starting to see people peel off. There's an organization called Republican Voters for Biden, which is made up of people who've worked on various Republican campaigns, including Romney and McCain and other presidential campaigns in the past, Jeb Bush's campaign. There's another called the Lincoln Project, which has gotten a lot of notice, where, again, McCain and Bush and other alums are battling Trump. Their challenge is they may not be allowed back into the conversation. And how you vote and what you do right now, you can stand up and have a lot of courage, but if the door is closed to you after this, are you allowed to help guide the party moving forward? That may further increase the likelihood of a split, or cause it to split in different directions. But there's a very real chance of that, especially given how there's a disconnect between the voters, Republican primary voters, and their leadership on what they think of Trump, and then how they react to a Trump loss if he loses, and what that margin is. And that's what we obviously will find out in a few weeks, or begin to find out, I should say.
I do talk to a lot of young conservatives, and I think, people in their 30s and 40s who've been voting for a decade or two, who have always voted Republican since the day they turned 18, and they're sort of feeling kind of an identity crisis politically. What do you say, because of the figurehead at the top, but also some other themes which you're welcome to talk about, which younger conservatives may not resonate as much with? Climate change, gay marriage. So what do you say to younger conservatives about the future of the party?
Yeah, one, that's where their involvement is more important than ever. And, we have now heard for several elections that this is going to be the year of the young voter, and then it sort of doesn't happen. Somewhat in 2018 it did. There was an increase, but they need to step up. And if these issues are important to them, their voices need to be heard. That's true if they're Republicans or Democrats or what have you. The challenge for Republicans is younger voters are hearing not that we disagree with the issue on climate change, that we have different ideas about what the solution might be, but a broad dismissing of any kind of a problem. And so if you can't even agree that there is a problem, much less what the specific problem is, you've lost any way to connect to that voter. And that is something that Republicans are doing wholesale to voters under 30. And when we think of young voters, we tend to think of like the 18 to 20-year-olds or people who are still in college, basically. The reality is that lasts for several more years as they're really trying to think through who they are. And if the Republican Party is essentially telling them what you believe is fact, we do not, whether you're talking about science or anything else, you've turned them off potentially for a lifetime. And the biggest predictor of how somebody votes when they're 50 is how they vote when they're 30. It's an existential problem.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So you see that there's potentially a lost generation. I mean, that's a very grand statement, but is that what we're looking at? A lost generation of young conservatives for the GOP?
Yeah, potentially so, because they may be fiscally conservative, but view social issues very differently. I mean, just look at how quickly things have moved on gay marriage and marijuana, where anti-gay marriage was a winning issue in Ohio for George Bush in 2004, and Republicans now just hope to not talk about it. Mm-hmm. That's a lightning speed of change. They risk turning off if not an entire generation, a significant part of it, and it's very hard to make up. Whereas Democrats are, I think, much more innovative in how they target younger voters. They use social media, I think, a lot more effectively, and they also agree with them on what the problem is, and that's the beginning of a conversation.
We do have a question actually about communicating with young people, and I'm just scrolling through here. Wonderful questions coming in. Thank you so much to our audience. Here's a question. What strategies should the Republican Party take when it comes to social media to connect with this new generation with social as their news source? Obama did very well in 2018. That's the question.
Yeah, look, one, it's about what the platforms are that you use. And younger voters use different platforms. I have a 14-year-old niece and a 12-year-old nephew, and I ask them all the time what they use, not because I'm necessarily interested in, the TikTok video of them dancing for 10 seconds, which I get incessantly, but that tells me where they are on things and how they're not really on Facebook. I remember about 7 or 8 years ago, it was 2015 when I was spending the semester at Harvard, when I heard a student say to another that Twitter's for old people. I thought Twitter was for younger people. It was a very important lesson to me. So there are different platforms. Then 2, it's how do you innovatively use it? And then 3 goes back to what we just talked about. You have to use their same language. That doesn't mean dumb things down. Doesn't mean that you have to talk like you're a 24-year-old, but that you are agreeing on what the issues are, which then gives you entry to talk about what your solutions will be.
We have 2 very similar questions, so I'll combine them, and it's about what the National Republican Party will do in the event that Trump loses. So both of the questioners are asking if Trump appears to lose and contest the results, do you expect the GOP to align with him or not?
Yes and no. Yes, in that the Republican National Committee works for the president. That's their job. So if the president tells them, to do whatever, go contest things in Florida, that's their job. That's what they're going to do. You may see some people peel off, but the structure of the party committee will do so. Things may be viewed rather differently on Capitol Hill. And that's going to be where we see what the margin ultimately is. My sense in looking at polling and kind of where the polling averages are is that we should know early whether or not we're going to have a late election. And if we see Trump really having a problem in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, for instance, okay, that tells us something. And that's going to tell us about Michigan and Wisconsin in the same way that on election night last time, when Hillary Clinton was having a problem in Virginia, I sent a text to a colleague who worked in Cantor's office with me, and I said, does this remind you of our election night? And he agreed, and we knew pretty early on there's a real problem for Hillary Clinton here. If it's going to be a late one, we don't know, obviously, if that's going to be 2 or 3 days, 2 or 3 weeks, whatever that may be. The party structure will back Trump with the caveat that if Mitch McConnell thinks this is a done deal and Trump is lost, he's going to try and move him as quickly as he can to get on with things. That protracted fight will not help Senate Republicans or House Republicans, for that matter, if they think ultimately that they're fighting a losing cause. Now, that comes to the third problem that they have, is the issue of fighting. For a big part of the base, that's what they want to see more than anything. They're not interested in bipartisan legislation or cooperation or what have you. And how you manage the accusation of rolling over and die will be a big one. That's where margins are going to matter rather significantly.
We have so many questions that I really want to get to, and maybe at some point in the next 25 minutes that we have left, you can talk about where the origins of that fight came from in the mid-2000s. Why suddenly?
Yeah.
Did the Republican base just want to fight for fight's sake? Which, to use your terms, it seems they don't want to negotiate. They don't want to do bipartisan things. They just want to be seen as fighting. Where does that come from?
We really started seeing it around 2010. I think it comes from essentially an unhappiness with the direction of the party, a sense that the party would roll over a lot and not fight on some of the bigger battles that it should. And, some of that was the Bush administration was not really the fiscal restraint administration that a lot of conservatives had hoped for, to put it mildly. Neither is the Trump administration, obviously. And then combine that with our media, and that's social and dominant. I was not referring to All Things Considered in Georgia specifically, but so if you're a conservative Republican voter, odds are your social networks consist of people who agree with you, and the radio and TV that you watch are things that agree with you, and essentially you all spin each other up. And there is this on the Democratic side as well, and I do see kind of a bizarro world, fantastical situation where Donald Trump could have done the same thing to the Democrats, because the two extremes have gotten farther and farther apart from each other, which means it's intensified. And one of the things I should say as well is the Republican Party essentially is smaller today than it was 4 years ago. That means that, to use a bad analogy, like making a reduction sauce, it's a lot more intense. So these are more intense supporters for the president. So he can, when he points and says 90% of my party backs me, he's right. That's just a smaller number. And again, speaks to the previous question of, where fractures may happen within the party.
You mentioned fiscal conservatism, and here's a question from an audience member named Tom Grant, who says, assuming Trump loses, what will the Republicans' key positions be other than low tax? Trump appeared to pull the party in the direction of tariffs rather than free trade and in favor of large budget deficits and tax cuts, with little concern around fiscal responsibility. What will be the key positions of the post-Trump Republican Party?
Well, I'm hoping that's Tom Grant in Boston. If so, it's good to see you. If not, apologies. I go back to the 2012 convention in Minneapolis, and we had a running clock of what the debt was, the Obama debt clock. And we meant it at the time. Trump comes in, we obviously stopped meaning it immediately. If we go into a situation where there's a Democratic president, Democratic House, potentially Democratic Senate, well, we will be somewhat a party of fiscal restraint again. We'll be powerless to do anything about it. We'll make a lot of noise about it. Will it be hypocritical? Absolutely. We'll be called out on it quite a bit, but there will be that return to that. We'll go back to some of the things we used to believe. I think the most interesting one is trade. The Republican Party has typically been a free trade party. There have been strains of protectionism in it, but that's really been the minority. It's consistently the one thing you hear from Republican members where they're, aside from the tweets, where they're exasperated by Donald Trump. And there will be some return to that as well. But a challenge for them is you can be effective in pushing for tariffs. To be quite selfish about it, I want my Chablis and my Bergen to be 25% less than it is right now. But there is a big part of the American electorate, a lot of Democrats as well, who want to stick it to anybody. And as jobs are going away, especially manufacturing jobs, supporting tariffs, even though Americans are going to pay for it, is something that they're okay with. I was in Emmitsburg, Iowa, the summer before last, and I was talking to a friend of mine there who's a soybean farmer, and asked, how, mostly soybeans, but some corn too, how are these tariffs affecting you? And he said, they're killing me. He said, but I'm going to give Trump the benefit of the doubt, because Barack Obama, George Bush, Bill Clinton, George Bush, Ronald Reagan all did the same thing, and we got nowhere. And so that voter is still giving Trump the benefit of the doubt on that. And so I think we'll see that sticks around for a while longer. Good to see you, Tom.
Yeah, it is Tom. He confirmed it's Tom Grant, the one you thought. We have so many incredible questions coming in, and I want to thank our audience. My font is very small, so I'm scrolling frantically trying to keep track of everything. I'm going to try to get to everything. So here's one. I don't have the name of who's asked this. It says, you talked about the rise of the Tea Party as caused by tax increases in Obamacare, but failed to mention the racism that was the basis of all that The Tea Party and Freedom Caucus quickly went away from taxes and right into racism. That's not a question, it's a statement, but I'll give you an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, so I think there's some truth in there. Look, the Tea Party stood for tax already. That's why it was the Tea Party. Obamacare became a very important part of that. We started to see some strains of racism in there. That was terrible. I will tell you, when I worked at the Republican National Committee, we had a situation where a staffer tweeted, and we should all remember there's no such thing as sarcasm on social media or typed words, tweeted a sarcastic joke about Obama being a Muslim, and that was my day. And I had to go to Todd, who's otherwise a really good guy and didn't mean to offend. I'm going to throw you so under the bus, and he understood it because it's wrong, and Republicans need to say that more. John McCain corrected a voter at a debate or a town hall who said that Obama was Muslim or something like that, and said, no, we're not doing that. Unfortunately, we've seen a real rise of things in the past few years that a lot of Americans thought were dead and gone, and we've seen them stoked from the president. What's been, kind of troubling to me is a lot of Republicans will say, and you see this almost every week, yeah, the president shouldn't have said that. So there's their mild criticism of, say, Charlottesville, but he should talk about making America great again. And again, you see this every week. Trump has really given a rise to a racism that clearly was in a dormancy, but there, and pulled it out of hibernation. And we're seeing this play out, nationally in front of all of us. What the solution to that is, I'm not smart enough to know, but part of it has to be, responsible rhetoric from our president. He has the biggest microphone in the world, and unfortunately quite often uses it for malice.
Speaking of the world, let's talk about the United States standing in the world. We have a question from James Lowenstein. Does the fact that America is less admired abroad than at any time since World War II concern Republicans?
The short answer is some. If you talk to folks who are clearly engaged into world affairs, they see the standing falling, year by year, month by month, almost like a tracking pole. They know it's largely attributable to one person. I remember having a conversation last year with somebody at the British Embassy who said, I wonder if there really was a special relationship at all. And I thought, my goodness, what a terrible comment. But the fact that he even thought that, told me that there's a lot more going on, and that it's not just personality driven. To a lot of the country, they don't care. America has to be number one. We're going to make America great again. American exceptionalism, all that other kind of, frankly, nonsense that we've heard. Unfortunately, Republicans were the party of freedom fries, which I could tell you an awful and embarrassing story about when I was in Bone. But you see this. So the Republican Party has typically had what I would call a healthy dose of anti-intellectualism. And that has really morphed in the past few years into basically being against, book learning. And this is something that is part and parcel with that. I don't wake up every day and think, my goodness, what do the French think of us? What are the UK thinking of us? But it's here. It's in my head. I do think about it. And, unfortunately, we consistently send the wrong messages to them and the wrong messages to our adversaries, as well. But it's unfortunately not a real voting concern for Republican primary voters. And I would say it's a very good talking point for Joe Biden to use, but it's not really an effective talking point, it's not really a voting issue for Democrats either. Yes, it's something that they want to see, America's honor and dignity and so forth restored, but that's not what they're voting on. They're voting on the pandemic, the economy, on pick your issue with what they have with Donald Trump, from everything from family detentions, on down. There's a whole lot there before they even get to anything about real foreign affairs.
And that's been the case for so long. I mean, unfortunately, to a group like this, this is an audience that feels very strongly about our global standing in the world. We have about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to try to get through as many of these wonderful questions as possible. So we have a question about, obviously, Trump's style of being president. It's a two-parted question. Why aren't more Republicans standing up to Trump? I think you've sort of already answered this. But the second part of this question is, do you see him aligning himself with autocratic and not democratic rule?
Yeah. So on the first, put yourself in the position of a Republican who's running for re-election. Being from North Carolina, I'll say Tom Tillis. Tom Tillis wrote an editorial in the Washington Post, very critical of Trump on his emergency declaration on immigration several months ago, last year. And then he had to immediately walk it back. If you're a Republican, you can criticize Trump on particular issues, some of which we've gone over. Look at Marco Rubio, who talks about the administration position on China quite a bit. But if you go at Trump on anything that's personal to Trump, and so immigration would be one of those things, the wall, another good example, which there isn't one, you will not be rewarded by your voters, right? And politicians want to be reelected. That's why they're there, to be bluntly cynical about it. So, the call, and I hear it on television every day that it's always the term stand up. The reality is what you're asking is for them to write their resignation letter immediately, because any Republican on that ballot, is essentially damned if they do and worse if they don't. They'll get no credit from independents or Democratic voters, or at least not enough credit to get a vote, and their base will walk away from them immediately. And so Tillis then, right now, he's in a neck and neck race. If he were to condemn Trump on COVID, because Tom Tillis has COVID right now, and to really go after Trump, he doesn't lose by 1 to 3 points. He loses by 7 to 12 points. And there was a second question, which I'm forgetting.
That's fine. It's unrelated, but it's important to in terms of style of rule, which.
Yes.
Do you see him aligning with autocratic and not democratic rule?
Yeah. I mean, look, who does he compliment, right? He compliments the strongmen. So it's Oban, right? It's Kim Jong. It's Xi. It's Putin. These are the people that he admires. And I won't make the comparison to him standing on the Truman balcony the other night to the famous Mussolini image. But if anybody else wants to, I'm not going to argue that with you.
It's been done on Reddit already. I'll tell you that much. Great questions still coming in. So let me just scroll down a little bit. Let's see. Oh, this is actually about it's a comment from, I believe it's Thomas Quirk, who says, solution, eliminate or fundamentally alter primaries. So maybe you could explain the role of primaries in selecting ultimately who becomes the candidate, and whether you would suggest any changes to the primary system. And this obviously impacts both parties. Yeah.
So every state, 50 states, we all do primaries differently, or have the ability to. But essentially, Republicans run in one, Democrats run in another. Some states will have everybody run kind of against each other. And when you have that system, you can then have where only Democrats can vote in the Democratic primary and only Republicans can vote in the Republican primary. That tends to mean, and you're seeing this, obviously, Rickey, in Georgia right now, even though it's not a primary, a race to who can be the most conservative, who is the biggest Donald Trump supporter. On the left, it will be the exact opposite. This is part of what's made these Congress and in the Senate just further apart from each other. And this is true on the state level, not just on the congressional level. So it's not just an issue of how the congressional lines have been drawn. My home state of North Carolina, if you're an independent voter, you can vote in either primary. Not every state allows that. I think that might be a good way to go. Other states are experimenting with, let's have what's called a jungle primary. And the top two people who emerge from that are the two candidates. In California, that means it may be two Democrats who are running for the Senate, not a Democrat versus Republican. There's not really a perfect system. We're kind of seeing how the jungle primary situations will work and what the best option is. But again, I think as rules have changed, it's also enabled kind of a move to this more extreme that, again, quite often is not about an issue. It's about tactics and tenor and tone, which ultimately lead to a lot of what we've seen right now, talking about strong men and so forth.
And for those in our audience who want a live, to watch a jungle primary live, that's what's happening in Georgia right now. We have 20 candidates and the top 3, 2 Republicans and a Democrat. And it's truly, the name jungle primary absolutely applies. It is chaos. And we certainly do expect a runoff is very likely. So keep watching Georgia at least through early December. And also send me flowers and chocolates because it's going to be a long 2020 for the rest of my 2020 covering things. Let's just pivot to tonight's debate, Doug. We're going to be looking at the only, many of us will be watching the only vice presidential debate between Mike Pence and Kamala Harris. What do you expect?
Everything and nothing, which is a bit contradictory. Look, we are talking about 2 very skilled debaters. And nobody's really seen Mike Pence debate in 4 years. So we've kind of forgotten. He's very good, very methodical at this. Kamala Harris, we've seen a lot of. And we obviously saw her first moment with Joe Biden when she went right after him and was very effective. So I expect this is going to be a fascinating debate. Obviously, the news of the past week has really, kind of heightened the awareness and the intensity around it. Ultimately, though, I doubt that it's going to have a significant impact on the election, given that this is really about Joe Biden versus Donald Trump and what people want. It's not about Kamala Harris versus Mike Pence. It's just not. Now, the one thing that will be interesting, of the things that will be interesting to me is, will this be the last debate? It's very realistic to see a scenario where Joe Biden says, I'm not debating Donald Trump until we know that he's negative. It seems pretty reasonable. And if folks haven't heard, there will be plastic dividers between Pence and Harris tonight. So that will not just be a prop, that will be talked about at least at some point. The Pence team is really going after Harris on this. If there aren't any more debates, that could make this have more of an impact than it otherwise would. But as we've seen with so many things around this election, what we're talking about on Wednesday is not what we're talking about on Friday. And I think for a vice presidential debate, when it's not the top of the ticket, that's most likely going to be the case, with the full caveat that obviously there could be some kind of explosions in this where I am completely wrong.
But following up, particularly since the topic of our conversation is the future of the Republican Party, what key themes do you expect at least out of the vice president?
Well, look, the vice president works directly for the president. So there won't be any themes that are different from Pence than you'd get from Trump. What you won't get is kind of the belligerence. He will comport himself in a more traditional way. And Pence clearly wants to run for president in 2024. And his best shot at that is having that Trump base. So you won't see any separation on issues. You won't see any talk of, yeah, we did this or this or this wrong, because as we know, Donald Trump's never done anything wrong. So Pence will be a more competent and less belligerent version of what we saw at the last debate. And I just hope that this debate is watchable compared to the last one.
Doug, do you have any wrap-up final comments and thoughts you'd like to share with us this afternoon?
Well, one, thank you to everybody. And I'm always happy to do things like this, especially for my French friends and for Tommy Grant. I just reemphasize, there are so many different variables at play here for Republicans in a way that we don't really see for Democrats. Democrats have their own divisions that we're starting to see play out, the Biden wing versus the squad and so forth. But it's more real on the Republican side. And the fight has been going on longer on the Republican side. We all focus on the national issues and the national struggles. This is being fought in the states, and this is being fought down on the county levels. And so what is happening in Iowa right now, for instance, is the jockeying for position for who's going to be the next county chair in individual counties. That's going to have an enormous influence on, the next Iowa caucus. And I think Republicans will have another Iowa caucus. Democrats, possibly not. But this is happening in every state where these battles are being fought out. And activists tend to be more committed. And that's why we've seen this shift in state and local parties over the past few years. I think a lot of Republican incumbents who've been there for 10 years or longer might not be successful candidates this time around, just given how things have changed on a local level. That's why their leadership is important as well. The disconnect between leadership and the grassroots has never been higher, even if we don't see all that playing out on day to day because they can't have any real divisions play out in public. But once we get past election day, whether he wins or whether he loses, Donald Trump's a lame duck, and the ground will start to shift one way or another.
Doug Heye, thank you so much for joining us today.
So happy to. Thank you.
And for all of our guests in the audience, thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day this Wednesday to learn a little bit more about the future of the Republican Party. I would like to thank the French American Foundation and the French Institute Alliance Française for hosting today's event. And please, if you'd like more information about the French American Foundation, you can go to their website and sign up for their newsletter, which comes out every couple of days or at least once a week with all sorts of fascinating events and Zoom webinars and learning opportunities and networking opportunities. So be sure to check out the French American Foundation newsletter. And with that, we'll say, have a great afternoon.